are joined in this episode. Welcome to New World BrassCast, by the way. We are joined by Dr. Stephen Arthur Allen again for a second episode, and Sam Lake, fellow graduate of Rutgers University and phenomenal tuba player. So welcome.
Thank you.
So we had this idea. Sam and I were talking after Athena, after a few drinks, about how it would be really cool to have someone on the podcast who is really quite accomplished as a musician, but hasn't really experienced brass band stuff all that much. And to have them ask some questions of someone who knows a lot about brass band stuff. And that is where the idea for this episode came about. So we have someone who is very accomplished on her instrument and hasn't had a ton of experience in brass band stuff, Sam Lake. And we have someone who is very experienced in brass band stuff, and that's Dr. Allen over here. So, yeah. Do you want
to just start with a disclosure that although I don't have the most brass band experience, we did meet playing in Athena.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So I was so honored to get that invite and to meet so many people and to see you again there. And I hadn't played in brass band before that since I was at my undergrad at UConn. There was a local brass band there that that students subbed in as needed. So I had a long hiatus. It felt like the beginning of my studies to the very end. But again, just as a classical tuba player, as needed, faking my way through it, transposing all the parts, complaining all the way. Yeah.
That's just what tuba players do, complain about treble clef.
Yeah. And last minute retyping everything like a crazy person. So I know there's probably no stupid questions, but I probably have some silly ones. So you'll have to let me know if the premise of anything.
I love silly ones. I was hoping it would be mostly silly ones, actually.
And if they're not,
I'm very silly myself, so you know.
Yeah, if they're not silly questions, there are certainly going to be some silly answers.
Tony knows me too well.
So I was thinking, I learned from the introduction in Athena that brass bands came about in the industrial age. But then also yesterday, I was reminded that we declared independence from England far before then. Why is this British heritage, this British, what do you call it? Yeah, this, it's a
tradition.
Very British tradition. There it is, a very British tradition. Why do we have it now in America? We're independent though.
Well, because in England, we call Independence Day Good Riddance Day. You knew that. Well, there's a very long answer to that, but let me see if I give you the real short one. Adolf Sachs designed a complete series of conical bore horns, and in 1851 they were exhibited at the British Exhibition. And cut a long story short, brass bands switched over to the Sachs horns. And in America, there's an amazing coincidence between the laying of railway lines and the invention of the valve, because it meant that, in effect, in the same way that the guitar became an enormously popular instrument in the 1960s, brass instruments were that in the 19th century. In other words, the invention of the valve meant that everybody could play a brass instrument. And as most of us know, you can learn quite quickly, get to quite a high standard quite quickly, relatively, on a brass instrument. And then it's very slow compared to a lot of instruments that are very slow throughout. And with Americans being very practically minded, it probably really appealed to them. And one stat I can give you is that there were 1 in 40 Americans playing a brass instrument in 1900, which is an astounding statistic, right? So one of the things I learned, Sam, when I first came here is one of my aunts on Laurel's side of the family gave me this book by the Hagans, which introduced me to this whole brass band tradition that had existed before Sousa. So actually, very subversively, the brass band is actually the primary original American sound. So part of the way I've explained to myself and to others the popularity of what the so-called British brass band sound, and I'm uncomfortable with that description because it's not really a British thing anymore, but it does help to distinguish it, I guess, from like jazz brass bands, so there's no confusion, right? I think it's partly to do with that. I think brass is in the American blood, going all the way back to like the Civil War period. It's funny because there's a Charles Ives song where the person sings about seeing the cornet walking, the cornet player playing in the town square, and it's a brass band that Charles Ives is talking about. It's really great stuff. So that's my short answer.
I wanted to interject with something in there. I remember reading there's a textbook where they had a picture of Lincoln's funeral, and their playing at Lincoln's funeral was a brass band. They called it an orchestra because whoever was writing had no clue what they were looking at. But there at Lincoln's funeral was a brass band, and in every regiment during the Civil War, they had a brass band as well. So I've noticed when I read about things from the American Civil War, they frequently will just call them bands, or when you see them in a picture, they'll refer to them as orchestras. And I think that it's a major oversight from the people who are writing the captions or the text, that they don't know what ensemble they're looking at. And so I've seen them misidentified more than correctly identified, I think.
Also, maybe the term is coming to mean different things, just like now we have to call British brass band so that you don't imagine a marching band or something jazz style. I'm starting to wonder now, why did the clarinets join the band? Why couldn't we just say brass? Why do middle school programs all start with flutes?
Gilmore and Sousa.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
They took over and became immensely popular around the turn of the century, and that's what led us towards our wind ensemble path.
The other interesting thing, Sam, is right around the same time as British soccer, which we call football over there, right, was determined how many players would play in a team and where they would play. Similarly, because of competitions, it was decided that a brass band would consist of the instrumentation that we currently know it for. One soprano cornet, 10 cornets, flugelhorn, tenor horn, baritones, euphoniums, trombones. That was kind of standardized. And interestingly enough, when the Salvation Army got into the brass band thing, they adopted that standardization. There are a couple of variations where they may not have a repiano cornet or a second trombone. There are little anomalies here or there, but it's actually remained fairly between the so-called brass band movement and the Salvation Army brass band, which was a part of their evangelistic effort. So it was actually the brass band movement was primarily taken around the world initially by Salvation Army. So for example, in America, the Salvation Army British style brass band has been here a lot longer than the so-called secular brass band movement type bands, And then with things like NABA, the North American Brass Band Association Championship, and other championships that have grown up around the country, that's then created another linchpin for the growth of that particular, that particular sound. So
are there other differences besides instrumentation between a brass band in your community or a community band?
Well, yeah, there's a big difference. There's a big difference between a brass band and any other kind of brass ensemble. And this is often difficult even for brass players to understand if they haven't encountered it before, right? And it's primarily because everything's pretty much conical except the trombones. So in a brass band, the trombones are effectively the brass section. If you think of it as a brass orchestra, the trombones are kind of like the brass section. In other words, trombones are often used, and I'm going to get shot to death by trombonists. I'm going to get hate mail. I'm very sensitive and I cry easily, so I hope there's not too much of that. But the trombones are often used to add weight, right? So, for example, a symphonic brass ensemble with trumpets, French horns, trombones, everything's pretty much cylindrical. It's a very, very different type of animal. Anybody that's worked in both those media will tell you it's almost like going from strings to a wind band. Because although they're brass instruments, the actual sound and the sound concept is very, very different in terms of the way that the sound is shaped. Would you guys agree with that? Amy and Tony, in your experience, think that's pretty true?
Yeah, definitely.
It's kind of a chalk and cheese thing, which blows people away because it's all brass, right? They think, wait, it should sound the same, but it's actually quite different.
Yeah, I feel like I cheat. Like tubas will play the same instruments in either, so we're like the through line a little bit, but or with the trombones as well. But you're right. Like a full cornet section is something that you wouldn't see anywhere else. I was thinking, you mentioned competition.
Yeah.
And that also feels really unique because a community band that you might join as a hobby would not have a competition schedule. Is that really like foundational to what a brass band is, or is that just come about?
It kind of is foundational to what it is because it was there right from the very beginning. So, for example, the very first big brass band competition was in 1860. And that was the National Brass Band Championships down in London, which went on for about 3 or 4 years. Then there was a big break until it restarted in 1900. A few years before that, there was another one in the north of England called the British Open, and they are still the two big ones in the UK. And what happens, Sam? I mean, competitions are can always be a mixed blessing, right? Because there's pros and cons both ways. But given that it's mainly an amateur pursuit, like you said, it's a hobby. The competition has been credited with bringing about an incredible virtuosity and professional level of performance, which unfortunately, because the brass band tends to be somewhat incubated from other media, you know, it's funny, isn't it? Because we always talk about classical music, but classical music isn't really homogeneous. People that listen to opera don't necessarily listen to string quartets. People listen to piano music, don't necessarily listen to symphonies. So even within the classical world, there are silos. But oftentimes when people hear a brass band really in its full glory, I mean, Bram Tovey, for example, a really wonderful conductor who sadly passed away recently, he famously said that there's nothing of all the things he's ever conducted, every single type of combination of, when a brass band is really on form, and you know what they call a crack ensemble, he said there really is nothing like it. You know, there's a range of color and expressivity within those combinations of instruments that really is like an orchestra. It's almost like Stanley Kubrick wanting to make movies in black and white, because Stanley always maintained black and white has far more color in it than color. And so if you think of the brass band sound being like a black and white, and you think of the orchestra being like a color photograph, in their respective worlds, it's actually possible for a brass band to create an enormously wide range of different types of colors that I know from my experience of orchestral friends that I've had who've come in from the outside, much as you, I think, might have done yourself, Sam, right? It's almost like a revelation. It's like a flower suddenly opening up. It's like, wow, there's all this incredible repertoire, not only to play, where you're playing all the time, and the parts are often like playing a concerto part, right? Especially in the upper level test piece levels. It's like almost everybody's playing like a concerto level part, even though it's actually within the ensemble. And as I used to say, actually, when I was at Rutgers, I used to tell students, you know, if you leave Rutgers and fall off the edge of the planet simply because you simply cannot find ensembles once you've left college, we all can relate to this, which you have this wonderful experience in college with all these amazing sounding ensembles. You leave college, and then unless you get a professional position, you're often dealing with situations that are nowhere near the level that you experienced when you're at college, right? And without being chauvinistic about it, I told my students, you know, actually within the brass band fraternity, it's possible not only to find something equivalent, but actually something that will continually call you higher. If you go up through the ranks of the different sections with the band, you'll constantly be called higher, even if you have a 9-to-5 job doing something else.
Yeah, I as a working musician and freelancer, I often think about like the level of playing that, you know, is out there, the level of competition and the dedication, but without funding really.
Yeah.
For me, it makes me a little anxious because I'm like, musicians should get paid, right? I'm on that team.
Yeah.
So where are all these amazing musicians coming from? And is there like a diversity in background with a lot of these musicians? Like what's mostly the path to joining a competitive band?
I mean, I've done a lot of talking. I'm happy to answer it. Does anybody else want to chime in?
I think to set up a competitive band, I think requires a few different things. I think that the most competitive, the top bands have like a picture perfect combination of ingredients. I sometimes say that like that first section is like the top section with like with how do I say it, with a normal setup. The championship section bands have something that provides them with an extra deep pool of talent, like a really large population center, or being set up through a college. You'll see these things, or having people willing to travel for a very long distance. So I think that, and they tend to have figured out how to be at least relatively financially stable as well. So I think that if you go through the championship section bands, you'll see bands that have some combination of those. I think that's why the first section is frequently so big, because that's kind of like the I don't know how to say it. Do you want?
What do you mean by first section?
So Athena typically plays, well, Athena is, I think if Athena had time to rehearse more than 1.5 rehearsals, we'd definitely be championship section. But we have a rehearsal or two and then a show. Athena, the pieces that we tend to play are our first section pieces. Championship,
one below the championship.
Mm-hmm. So we have championship and then first, second, third, and I think the UK is fourth.
It may well have, yeah. And the evolution is really interesting too. Sorry, Amy, did you?
No, but yeah. I was just gonna say that I think some people grow up in brass banding. Some people with like backgrounds in like Salvation Army might find themselves in brass bands. Some people get connected while they're in college. I think a lot of people find brass bands when they're in college. And I think some people just stumble upon them, because they want to keep playing. I mean, what are some other ways that people kind of stumble into brass bands?
I think one of the things you have to understand about brass bands is the difference culturally between a community band and a brass band. Community bands are, well, I'll go to band on Tuesday nights, but if anything comes up, there's going to be 5 other tuba players there. I don't have to be there. They won't miss me. And they just play it on their terms. In a brass band, especially a top level brass band, the players in there are really after the highest level of musicianship and challenge musically that they can possibly get. And it's something that every person says, well, makes an agreement with themselves. Like, well, I want to play with the best players I can find on a regular basis and play the most challenging artistic music that I can find. And they'll do that through the competitions, because that music is what's feeding the soul of those players. And these bands will also fund themselves by playing Pops concerts the rest of the year as well. And they'll put up with those concerts so that they can play those 5 big gigs with the repertoire that they want, and the challenge of doing that. But the culture is really about, they center their lives around the band rather than the band is something that they decided to do at some point. And that means that they look for jobs that are in the area where their band could make it to band rehearsal twice a week. They're where they can rehearse, where they can have weekends off so that they can do the competitions. And it's really about, that band culturally becomes your second family. And you want to spend time with those people as much as anybody else, making music, developing friendships, traveling, and all those things. So it's a little bit more about a cultural thing. And in America, we don't really understand this nearly to to the degree that they do over in Europe for these types of things. But how close is my assessment on that, Stephen?
No, that's great. No, that's great, Tony. And I think just to pick up on the other part of your question, Sam, in terms of a historical perspective, I mean, I was lucky as a kid to play with one of the first college bands, and it was in the United Kingdom. It was then called the Birmingham School of Music, and it was called the Birmingham School of Music Brass Band. That evolved then into the Royal Birmingham Conservatoire, which now has its own brass band, right? But it was one of the very first college bands in the world, actually. And it wasn't just students, it was ex-students as well. But in 1979, they came third to Black Dyke and Corey in the national championships from a #1 draw. Now, you wouldn't know necessarily, that's very, very hard to do by any stretch of the imagination, let alone as a bunch of students or recent ex-students. What did that mark? Well, it really marked a transition that happened in the 60s. I think the Beatles and the whole explosion of pop and rock had something to do with this. Also the industries and the collapse of the industries, especially under Margaret Thatcher. Like in 1992, they closed the Grimethorpe Pit, which was one of the legendary bands, and that was symptomatic of a lot of closures. And at the same time, the brass band was increasingly being accepted in the academy. So, for example, down in London, James Watson, who's no longer with us, but was a great member of Philip Jones Brass Ensemble, some people know his name, great conductor of the Black Dyke Band, he really promoted the brass band at the Royal Academy of Music. And the Royal College of Music now has its own band. So, and over in the United States, it's probably fair to say that most bands, I'm being a bit careful because I don't want to sort of tar everybody with the same brush, but I was told when I came over here, if your band isn't actually attached to a university, you won't survive. Now, that wasn't actually true in the case of my band, but I think it is hard to. But increasingly, brass bands are being accepted over here. I've been involved in some of those fights personally, and once everybody gets over the fear, because there can initially be, brass bands are so awesome, they can intimidate and scare everybody else, especially if territory is involved, right? But once everybody calms down and realizes, no, they're not a big threat. In fact, everybody wins, because the standard of the brass playing goes up in general through the brass band experience, that the orchestral brass players get better, the concert band brass players get better, everybody gets better, because you have that essential ingredient also at work in the academy. It's very positive, you know.
Yeah, that reminds me of another question I was thinking of, is like, I know in some places students and kids can grow up through bands, but it's my understanding that that's always been like outside of a school system. So they might have like music in school, but the brass band is an extra organization. Is that fair to say?
I think this is very I've heard of a few situations where people have successfully incorporated brass into their school program, and it gets approved, especially in like inner city programs where they don't have a whole lot of money and they don't have a whole lot of kids. And so by going with brass and having kind of like a brass band / brass choir type setup, I've heard of some teachers being able to have brass instruments tend to survive more things more easily. By having fewer instruments, you're not going to have that bassoon in the closet collecting dust. You're going to use more instruments. You're going to have enough kids on every instrument. So I know, at least for a little bit, somebody who was in Philadelphia who did that kind of system, starting everyone on a brass instrument, so that there would be enough kids on each instrument and doing that. But I think outside of a few, sporadic examples, I think it is outside of the school. But I think I'm seeing youth brass bands getting started up at a crazy rate right now. I mean, I think, does everyone else agree? I mean, yeah. It's becoming part of the brass band ecosystem that you want to set up. You want to have a youth brass band, maybe a lower section brass band and a higher section brass band. And so the kids can get the extra music education outside of the school setting, get pushed a little bit further, and then get bitten by the brass band bug and realize that also whatever ensemble it is, you don't have to pack up your instrument at the end of high school if you're not planning on being a music major. And planting that idea in those kids' brains is really important. So whether it's brass band or wind ensemble or orchestra or whatever, planting the idea that there is a place where you can keep playing.
Yeah, I don't think brass bands get enough credit, or at least youth bands get enough credit for keeping those musicians playing in college when they don't study music. But a lot of them, at least our experience here, is that they continue playing in college just because that idea of brass band is something you're going to be able to play the rest of your life. So keep playing, because eventually you're going to get to work your way back into a brass band. So they play in their college band, even though they're studying microbiology or pharmaceuticals or anything like that. And they just keep studying and playing so that someday they'll get back into it. And a lot of high school bands are nowhere near as successful at keeping more musicians studying or playing in college through that.
Does instrument ownership become like a barrier, especially for the I'd say more niche instruments like the E flat horn or something? Like, do bands usually own those or individuals?
Usually the bands.
My youth brass band owns several cornets, all the tenor horns, and I just purchased the 2 E flat basses.
You don't even want to know how you don't even want to know how many instruments we own.
Yeah, I bet.
We own at least 12 or 14 tenor horns.
Yeah, I believe it.
I think anybody should ever own that many.
The really good thing about being in Columbus and getting tenor horns is that Ohio State used to use tenor horns for marching. So you can always find used older tenor horns for sale.
Yeah.
They're not top of the line, but they're still doing a great job however many years later. So
Yeah,
we just picked up a few of those.
I've never thought of of an obstacle, the instrument being an obstacle. I mean, there are many obstacles to getting into a brass band, but if you want to play, you can find an instrument. Somebody's not going to give you one, per se, but you can always, go on eBay and buy one, or you can go to a music store and buy one, or order one, so if you really want to play in a brass band, the instrument's not going to be the obstacle.
Well, I mean, in my youth brass band, it's payment optional, and the kids will get an instrument. They may not get the exact instrument that they want, because I don't have any euphoniums, I don't have any baritones, and I don't have any trombones. But if you want to play, I have an instrument for you. And as I learned last season, if you want to play and you're a woodwind player, here's some auxiliary percussion. Welcome to the group.
Or tenor horn.
Well, I actually had
baritone.
Quite a few. I don't own any baritones yet for the youth brass band, but
Are the plastic ones of any great?
No.
No.
I mean, they're great for the fact that my sons can throw it against the wall and it still plays.
Yeah. I'm gonna play the snob card on that one. I will not. I will not stand for this.
Have you tried the plastic tuba yet? They exist. I'm afraid.
I absolutely love the plastic tubas. And if it were $500, I would own one. But I'm not paying $3,000 for a plastic tuba. I'm just not doing it.
Oh my gosh, that's the price for those. It's ridiculous. The plastic baritone, there's a different kind of plastic baritone, and it's $130. So my boys both have those, and you can play it, and it's great for kind of like playing a little bit, and we'll play Taps Across America with them and stuff, and they can But as for like,
I'd pay $130 for a plastic tuba for sure.
Yeah, and that's like P-bone territory.
Yeah,
P-bone. Yeah.
I take it on gigs too. I'm just playing whole notes anyways. What does it matter?
But I think sometimes if there were an obstacle, I think the biggest one is in the bass section with finding those E flat basses. Because especially in the youth environment, these kids are not going to have an E flat bass.
No,
Yeah, I'm just
but
thinking, like,
we
growing up learning tuba, no one else around me owned a tuba. Like, you graduate high school, you maybe play it in college, and then you're certainly done. Like, I know music majors who don't own a tuba almost by the time they graduate, and it could be a huge thing. Of course, there are a lot of tuba options out there. Like, there's a huge scale of prices for tubas, but you know what I mean? Like, I know if I wasn't on this career path, I might not own a tuba. That felt like the big hurdle. I know for a lot of people, even if they love to play tuba.
Yeah, I think several bands that I've been in have owned a tuba, so it's like, if you don't have one and you want to play, we have one for you. You may be on E flat when you prefer to be on B flat or something. And I've seen some people bring their C. I think I saw Jan Duga playing her C at NABA. No, not at NABA. What was it at? Yeah, it was something. I saw Jan playing her C. And I was like,
no, we're all cheating that last Athena one. I was nervous. I'm like, I'm definitely like, I'm on my C on this B flat part. I feel like I'm being so naughty, but I can't get my hands on a B flat super easy last minute. But then I found out we were all on F and C.
Yeah. I've actually competed in a band where we had an E flat, an F, a B flat, and a C.
That's
the whole rainbow. That's beautiful.
I've actually, because with my band, we would actually use F and C tubas as well. And when I had Philip Harper clinicking the band, I would say, like, so tell me what you think about the sound of the tubas. And I could not get him to say anything other than, man, they sound great. I was like, no, but do they sound wrong?
Getting away with it. Yes.
Yeah, he wouldn't bite. At the end of the day, I would love to have this experiment go on. Is the difference between a section of B flat and E flat and C and F, because there's a different level of clarity you can get out of the section when they're playing on C and F, and there's a level of just bassiness or woofiness or whatever that you get from the B flats and the E flats. And it'd be interesting to see if there could be a battle royale where the industry standard changed to the C and F, because maybe the only reason it's not changed is because we've never done it and we can't change,
Well, I feel like it's happening, but tuba player by tuba player, stubbornly, like, I'm not buying a third or fourth tuba, or
I'm not learning any new fingerings, or it's an uniquely American thing. C tubas is very prevalent, and it's actually more rare to see a B flat, E flat bass section at NABA than anything else. There are bands that are getting to that, but it's tough to find that.
And it's great going back to the treble clef problem, especially with the B flat transpositions, right? There's a number of sites now, like on Facebook, there's a brass band tuba bass clef site you can go to where you can ask for pieces. just get the tuba parts in the bass clef. So I don't know whether you knew that already, Sam, but that's a useful piece of information.
I am not fully inducted into the world, so I'm taking notes. I did like panic arrange all the music before the Athena.
I like that term. You panic arranged it.
Because I'm like, I could do this in my head, and then I'm like, no, it's maybe not worth it to do it like that. But then as soon as I show up, I realize, like, the transposition clicked if I just pretended the C tuba was an F tuba and that it was bass clef, and then you change the key signature. Yeah. But I know, and there would be moments where, like, as soon as my part got important, my brain would like dissolve.
Yeah, that always happens. But yeah, that you nailed it, the F tuba. But at the end of that, you do a 2-hour rehearsal thinking like that, you definitely are brain dead, and you have to refresh it somehow, because it's more mentally challenging to play in a brass band for a tuba player than it is physically, because you're playing low notes most of the time anyway. That's not really tough on your chops, but boy, your brain thinking, I can't miss that natural is a flat. Okay,
I think we also, in general, we're just like, hyperventilating so much that does something else to my brain too. Maybe like not like muscularly, like yeah, this we're fine here, but like I literally the oxygen deprivation. Yeah.
I remember doing breathing exercises with my undergrad euphonium professor, and at a certain point, we just started laughing because we were so oxygen high. We were just like, we just broke out into laughter, and both of us were like, "Wee!"
Sorry,
Going
love this so
between
much.
that and like not being able to breathe for like however many measures must do fun things to our brain.
Thinking about all the key stuff that's going on, honestly, I think it's a beautiful thing. Like from the origins, that the idea was people could switch and read different music, play on different instruments, with a lot of ease. Because right now the system we have, trying to explain it to like brass classes, and the different transpositions with woodwinds, even it just becomes a little bit like all the students are asking is why. And at least in brass band, just in that bubble, it all can make sense, and it feels like purposeful and matched to the equipment. Is it orchestra's fault that all transpositions are so gnarly right now?
Well, I've actually had this gripe about British brass band cornet players, or actually all brass bands, because when they look at the treble clef staff, they'll see the third space C and call it a C, not a B flat. When it comes out a B flat, yet the part is specifically written B flat treble clef. So as a tuba player who doesn't transpose, I'm like, why won't you call it what it is? I don't understand that. And that would alleviate all of this discussion, because what essentially they're doing, it's all the trumpet players that play cornet, they're transposing. They're just calling it different than what it actually is. So it's a light version of transposing. But for the life of me, after 100 some years of this, Stephen, how come they don't call it B flat a B flat?
Because the scientists have proved that the Big Bang was in B flat. And
That was not what I was expecting to hear.
I
I'm not
told you
joking.
some of these answers would be silly.
I'm not actually joking. Actually, that's serious. That is serious science. So I always jokingly said, you see, brass bands were always God's chosen key. It's concert pitch that's wrong.
Oh,
Call me a brass band chauvinist.
I really do tend to. I know we have these tuba players who are transposing and don't like bass clef, but I mean, don't like treble clef. But I switch back and forth constantly. Like if I'm doing a recital, I'm gonna choose whichever clef works best for that piece. If it's a really high piece, it's like if it's a really high piece and someone, I'm gonna ask if they have a treble clef version of it, because
Yeah, less ledger line.
When we did a critical edition of the 7 suite, we had what we call world parts. I said to Mike, can you generate, let's get French horns, let's get all of the baritones down in the bass clef. So we got everything, because as you guys know, there are sets that they call world sets, where you have all the brass band stuff in the treble clef, but then they also provide other parts in the bass clef alternatively too, which I think is a great idea. And now we're in our electronic age and we don't have to worry too much about paper. It's even easier to do it, isn't it? With AI coming very soon, we're just going to be able to tell AI, write a piece of music, write a piece of music in the style of Benjamin Britten, brass band, in the style he was writing it in 1970, and arrange it in every clef, and it'll just do it.
I want like baby. Right? I want like baby steps. Can I just be like, can you transpose this to bass clef for me? And it just do it. Cause that would be like that. Cause that would be, but I like having that option of that second clef, because if it's high, if it's technical, it's easier to read in treble clef, because my part, technical stuff on euphonium tends to go really quite high, and I'm reading 3+ ledger lines above the staff. No, thank you. I'm just gonna take it in treble clef and go yoink down a little bit lower, and
that's trombones and tenor clef and everything.
It's the same thing. Yeah,
I'm reading a Prokofiev tuba part.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm like, tuba players can't avoid it because we need to do it in both directions. The
Right.
lower ledger lines are unavoidable.
That's
And then the
true.
higher ones, I was so mad when I got to college and I'm like, upper ledger lines, let's relax. It's fine.
True.
How many is, oh, that's a B flat. That's a double high B flat. Ah, that's a
I'm
lot
still
of lines.
writing in notes. Yeah, yeah.
The farther they go in each direction, the more you have to write.
But it's way off the page. I like how, I know clefs are probably designed for like a range of like a voice, something a little bit manageable, relatable, and then the technology, has it gone too far? Yes. I was also thinking, so we have to transpose a little bit differently as tuba players, where we normally are looking at the music and then we get to choose what instrument we want to match to that. But of course, not everyone does that either. Like the history of trumpets having different instruments for different parts. So that's more the brass band transposition. But I like the idea that a player playing different instruments would then have less to do in their head. Do people in brass bands today still switch between sections pretty frequently, or do people pick a lane and really specialize, like someone like me would have with tuba?
It tends to be more specialized. And I think the movement from, as I said before, right, let's say before the 1960s, where it was very much in communities like mining communities or industrial communities, where everything was done orally. You know, you got, if you're a euphonium player, actually, even when I was at college, I was taught by a trumpet player, that because there weren't euphonium teachers when I was at college, you know, so even that has changed. So the idea of specialization is much more set now, I think, within the culture, is my understanding of it.
I think that being said, there have been times that has saved us. You know, we moved one of my students from Rowan, they moved him to tenor horn for a bit because we always had like a plethora of people willing to be on the baritone euphonium row, but tenor horns are super hard to find, people who play tenor horn. And so he played tenor horn for a season. And you know, you can just pick up a tenor horn and you just play. You know, I mean, it messes with my brain because my relative pitch hangs on for just long enough to make me feel like I'm like, you know, like wibbly wobbly, but he could just pick up a tenor horn and go from that point.
And the repertoire's there now for it too. I mean, when I was at college, it was 4 euphonium pieces, right? It was the Horowitz Concerto, it was the Gordon Jacob Fantasia, Philip Spark Fantasy. I think that was probably about it. But now there are thousands and thousands of euphonium concertos, and I've watched actually the tenor horn go the same route in the last 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
There are now, you know, gazillions of serious pieces for a tenor horn player. So if you go to study the tenor horn at, say, the Royal Academy of Music or wherever, Rutgers or Rowan or wherever, you can now specialize because the repertoire is actually there, which it wasn't 20-25 years ago. So that's been a spectacular development too, even down to now euphonium players like Dan Thomas of Black Dyke. I think they commissioned Judith Bingham, who's a heavyweight classical, you know, to write him a euphonium concerto, you know. And euphonium players are now getting access to, you know, as are tuba players and everybody else, increasingly getting access to major composers who are now writing them this amazing repertoire. So when you pick up a tenor horn, there's no longer just an arrangement of some theme tune, which you actually now have original solos, which is baritone as well. Mm-hmm. Baritone has become an instrument completely in its own right that couldn't have been imagined, I think, 20 to 30 years ago.
I think some of this is because the composers, I've talked to a composer who didn't initially write for euphonium and tuba and low brass in general. And I remember him saying that he discovered at some point that since they had less literature going back for quite as long, that when he put something out for low brass instruments, that we'd all try it. We're like, hey, what's this? Well, you know, we don't have like, since we don't have literature that goes out so far, every time, you know, there's more of a chance to like find new stuff and move things along quickly and figure out what's good, what's not good. We'll all try it.
I saw there's a new concerto written for marching mellophone. The future is now. Yeah.
Really?
I love it. So I know a lot of instruments in the brass band also exist elsewhere. Of course, like the tuba, essentially same instrument. I know E flats and B flats will be like manufactured for its purpose. They might look a little different, but also, of course, euphonium, cornet sometimes, but more likely it's trumpet other places. Why hasn't the tenor horn like migrated to other ensembles? I know all the brass instruments were invented around the same time, like the valve was born and ta-da, you have tubas. But some of them in the middle seem to have gotten like a little bit dead-ended at the brass band.
That's true. That's true. Yeah, I mean, here's a real interesting one. Berlioz. Berlioz actually wrote for brass bands. The Trojans, the opera, you know, the huge multi-part opera. The Trojans has brass bands in it. He wrote cornet parts straight into Symphonie Fantastique as it was actually being invented, you know. And Berlioz, I mean, it's really interesting because Berlioz's overtures arranged for brass bands sound spectacularly well, you know. But then you think to yourself, oh, didn't Berlioz want to use euphoniums, you know, or even recently, I think of Tippett, Michael Tippett's Fourth Symphony was going to have 2 euphonium parts in it, and he ended up doing it for 2 tubas, just simply because everybody said it's actually better just to give it to 2 tubas because that's more, we have the players, they're already being paid, they're already there. We don't have to find a euphonium, you know.
Or
So
two.
it's a very, very interesting thing.
Yeah.
Marla,
I love playing Symphonie Fantastique, but I always feel it's a little naughty because I know it's not the sound that was original, but it's so fun though.
Yeah. That original sound was on the tuba was really rough, right? Off a Clyde as well in there,
Yeah.
or some other, yeah. And he really wanted this dry, hard sound, you know, quite different to what modern instruments can produce, unless you play them deliberately very hard.
Right. Yeah, I can't even imagine ophicleides being audible above a good contrabassoon.
Yeah, right.
Or good, you know, really good bassoon section because they blend, you know, bassoons
Yes.
can play pretty loud on that dies irae. You got to have
Yes.
some
All
crank and
4
tuba
of
players to be
them.
heard. Yeah, all 4 of them.
I heard someone argue that the sound should really be like bassoon centric, which is, I mean, it's rattling for sure. I'm very biased towards tuba, but yeah. But like the technology in the tuba, I feel like is still like even what people want to hear from a tuba has developed so far and like has changed a lot. But the tenor horn is almost like a piece of history in that the design hasn't changed very much, right, since the brass band became popular.
Well,
Yeah,
go ahead, Steve.
Oh, okay. No, I was going to say briefly, yes, you're right. And I would suspect that if you talk to a lot of tenor horn players, and I'm not one, so I can't really speak for them, but this is an assumption. I think it's a reasonable one. Most of them would say we don't necessarily want to migrate into those other ensembles simply because we have a home base now that is rich in its own terms. So in other words, a tenor horn player is much more likely to play a concerto or a solo in a brass band scenario than they would ever have if it migrated, say, into an orchestral or a similar type of scenario somewhere else. So I think it's a question to some extent of having your needs met, you know, in a certain way, which is not to say it wouldn't be wonderful to have a tenor horn be in those other types of ensemble, but to some extent I can't help but thinking it'd be redundant at this stage, that the orchestral palette is probably pretty settled for the most part. Could be wrong.
It's settled.
Was it?
It's settled.
Yeah, it failed.
It's standardized.
No,
Yeah.
It is.
I mean, you know, like as popular as saxophones are as an instrument, it's still not really going to make its way into a standard orchestra setup.
Not regularly, no. Not regularly, that's right.
Yeah, you're just happy if there's a tuba seat still there in an orchestra.
It'd be nice if there were 2. That would be helpful.
I know, we need more friends out here. Yeah.
I think part of the I mean, to totally flip that on its head, instead of focusing so much on orchestra, I think that we need to support all ensembles more, because I feel like so much support goes directly to orchestras, and they should get support, but but I think in the UK they have their equivalent of National Endowment for the Arts that we have supports community bands, supports brass bands. Like I've never heard of a brass band getting like National Endowment for the Arts type funding.
I think in England they have secured some lottery funds. I think I remember Black Dyke getting quite a big chunk from the National Lottery
Yeah,
years ago.
but like we don't, how
It's
cool would
mostly
that be?
local. It's
Yeah.
mostly local for grants and funding like that. The local communities support the local bands rather than the national. The national arts budget isn't nearly large enough
Right.
to trickle down that far,
Yeah.
into the brass band world. But if you have some good grant writers or connections, the brass band can get some good local funding that could be helpful.
But I think that it's a cultural remnant that the orchestra is somehow more
The
sophisticated
premier, yeah, it is.
than other ensembles. And so it's wishful thinking, but I think that it would be great if all ensembles were supported in, I don't know. I'm putting ideas out there and I can't finish them, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm thinking like strings have like chamber orchestras where it's like string family time, and there's brass family time. What about flutes and clarinets? Do they have their own little niche, or do they have to jump in on other bands and other orchestras?
Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, they don't seem to have that culture of like, I mean, there are tons of octets and stuff for winds. But they don't really have that like.
It's another field that's really grown in the last 20 to 30 years is the chamber music for brass band ensembles, and the tenor horn does feature very well actually in a lot of those types of ensembles. But no, it's a really interesting thing, Sam. I mean, there's also a flip side to it in that you have a phenomenon that a lot of students that go to college, mainly in the UK at this stage, deliberately do not pursue an orchestral career because they actually want to play in brass bands. Now, they know they can't make money doing it, but they would rather not make money doing it in a brass band than making money doing it in an orchestra, simply because of the interest in the music. And so they'll often take on teaching as a deliberate career strategy, simply to give themselves the freedom to be able to do the brass band rather than a professional career in orchestra, which I know does a lot of people's heads in. It's like, well, that just seems like a totally inverted logic to the conservatoire. Like,
How could you possibly want to play this stuff for free when you could get paid to do it? Which
and I think the problem is you're not paid to do it. You're paid. You're
right.
not paid. You're not paid to play the tuba part in Journey into Freedom, or the tuba part in Blitz, or the tuba part. You're paid to play pieces where you have to spend 150 bars counting rests,
Right.
and then ending with a low note.
Yeah. Well, I also think it's an interesting thing to think about if you were, a trumpet player that's trying to make it, as a freelance trumpet player, you have to play this church gig with this, really, really awful choir and choir director. You have to teach these students, you have to do these clinics, you have to go to this school, and you're doing it for peanuts, really. And then when do you ever get to play really good, sophisticated music with really top-notch players? Every once in a while, the symphony is going to call you and you get to sit in for that. But if you play in a top-level brass band and you or a banker or a real estate agent or something, that every time you get to play your horn, you're playing it with the best of the best. And you're getting to play high-quality literature. So it's really about the choices about, well, I only have this much amount of time that I'm willing to devote to my music, but I want it to be super high level. So you can really, work your life around getting to get exactly what you want. And then you can make enough money to support that habit and to feed a family when, humping it day to day as a freelance musician could be a big struggle.
Well, I know people who specifically search out for those elementary general music jobs. Yeah. So that they can do their freelance stuff, they can do their brass band stuff, they can pursue their playing career, but have that paycheck, because they're going to have they'll have the fall concert, the spring concert, you know, and maybe help out a little bit with the like a middle school musical or something, but they're not going to have the out of school commitment that a middle school or high school band director is going to have. They're not going to have jazz band meeting and marching band and pep band and everything.
Yeah,
So
bless everyone who does that hard work. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
right.
lot of hard work.
So
I knew
I know,
I was up to it a long time ago.
I know quite a few people who will find who are super accomplished musicians who find those elementary general music jobs, so that the end of the day they can go out and they can go to their gig or their brass band rehearsal or competition. A lot of the people in the top brass bands in the UK are you know, selling insurance, real estate agent, because they're on the road so much that, you know, they're doing whatever gig they can find that can enable their brass banding.
It's right. It's right.
Enables a fun word for it.
Enable, yeah. I think
Yeah.
Yes.
Enable is for sure the right word.
We're all just enabling each other. Well, you mentioning like a job in an orchestra for a tuba player is not the most exciting, but I feel so blessed every time I get paid to listen to everyone else make great music for a moment.
Of course.
Like, what a privilege. I just played a piece and I was like, I know, okay, that's a secret. I don't want to like, yeah, secret's out. But yeah, man, being tacit, so fun. But but it is a different balance of like, yeah, I'm always considering the dollar per time, dollar per effort. Like, yeah, it's a very unique decision point to be in personally. And I know some bands do have funding. What does it go to? Like, what are the expenses that bands are dealing with outside of, and then I have like maybe one more question, we can wrap it up. I'm just kind of curious because I know they do need funding to survive, right?
Yeah. Well, the biggest expenses are usually rehearsal locations and performance venue fees, staffing like artistic director or librarians, things like that. You know, some bands will use some of their funding to actually pay for the band's hotel or travel costs to get to the competitions. You know, it's all the things like that. You know, no band is getting rich.
Building a library.
Building a library, buying music.
I had a band where I built a library. It was about $73,000 when we totaled up at the end there what it was worth. You know, and it's like, wow, you know, that's a fair amount of money. You know,
how many charts were in that?
Oh, that's a good
Were you over 1,000?
You know what?
Probably 2,000.
I cannot honestly give you that number. I don't know.
Yeah, they add up after a while.
There's many years of ordering them, picking them up, getting them catalogued, all that jazz. You know, that could be a big expense. In the top bands, they do actually have retainers for some players. You're never going to get rich, but if you get say £12,000 a year or £6,000 a year, that can certainly help, right? You know,
gas money for a lot of players.
Gas money, yeah, exactly right. Yeah, because you're right, Tony. A lot of them travel many miles. I mean, many miles for rehearsal.
Yeah, I know some players in the Corey band that are traveling three hours each way twice a week.
Yeah,
just to play in the band, including their music director. I think he has a 2.5 hour commute.
But my job with Lancaster was that. That's why I had to give up Lancaster. Actually, it's simply because of the commute, because it was a 4-hour round trip.
Yeah,
often late at night. You know.
Yeah, it takes a high level of dedication, but I'm sure that you can hear it. You hear the dedication in the music too.
Yeah, you really can. You absolutely can.
Yeah.
Here's my last round question. What's your favorite thing about brass band, and why should I find one to join permanently?
All right, Stephen, you're gonna have to go first on this one.
Well, it's a split between the social, which can be very rewarding, great friendships, and the musical. The fact that you can accomplish. I mean, we just finished a project on a Vaughan Williams piece, which has been a dream of mine for a long time. Took 2.5 years to do it, mainly because of the technology. But I sit back and I think to myself, that's something that I'm really proud I've done. And I don't think I could have done it if it was necessarily with an orchestra, not knocking orchestras, but it's just that the standard of the playing and the standard of everything is just so amazing that you can actually get that, you know. And I think that a lot of people that get a high off of there. I mean, I have a very good friend who's not in the best of health at the moment, unfortunately, but he told me one of the highlights of his life was playing Resurgam by Eric Ball. And this guy traveled the world as a theatre, playing with theatre orchestras, pit bands, jazz ensembles, top notch. And yet he said one of the highlights of his entire life was playing Resurgam with the brass band. And I thought, wow, that's what it's all about. Great music and great friendships, relationships.
Yeah, I would say mine is, because I agree with everything that Stephen said too, and those are, definitely at the top of the list. But I would say it's the sound, the sonority that the brass band makes. If you're a real true brass player, then you just love being involved in loud sound, and nothing gets louder than a brass band, in an acoustic setting. So playing music that develops that sonority and those colors and textures with that sound as an orchestral brass player, it's just better because it's double the size. So it just gets double the loud. So that's my meathead brass player answer for that.
Oh gosh, I don't know what to say. I think there are lots of things that I like about brass band. I feel like I jumped in the deep end with my experience in brass banding and not really getting into brass band until I moved to the UK. And so I was kind of, surrounded by it very quickly. And I think that sound is kind of addictive. That rush of those moments, we can create huge, we can, like, I have words for them. I have like the moments that are like the open the door moments, close the door moments, where it's like the volume just like instantly doubles, like we can do things with dynamics that instruments with other ensembles might have trouble with. And those moments are so much fun to either be part of or be in the hall for. I also think that as a low brass player, the brass band is where I am challenged more than anywhere else. I mean, obviously I don't have a whole lot of experience in orchestra, but the experience I have is in counting rests for a very long time and then playing like 5 notes. And wind ensemble is a little bit better. You occasionally get some cool stuff in wind ensemble. But when you're sitting on the corner chair in a brass band, like
it's full on.
It is full on, and you don't really get much of a break. And as Steve said earlier on, that at a competition, you're playing stuff that is essentially like playing your part as a concerto. And so I love how it keeps challenging me. And I joke that playing in a brass band keeps me in shape for my paid gigs. because because if I tend to not get a whole lot of gigs. I tend to get like big gigs and then wait, and then get another big gig. And so if I didn't have anything, then it would be several months and then playing of nothing and then playing a concerto up in front of a big ensemble, which I'm very fortunate to get to do sometimes. But the brass band is what keeps me going.
Yeah. It sounds like Sam got our question of the episode question, there. We don't have to have Aaron come up with one at the last second.
Yeah, I don't know if we could actually hear Aaron. If you haven't noticed, Aaron is not on this recording. He has strep, and he said, "Well, I can be there, but I'm not saying anything."
Which is, of course, there's no point in having him here if he's not going to say something, because he will
do an
say
interpretive
something.
dance in the background.
I'd rather hear him say something silly, because he will.
Of course. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Sam and Steve. It was wonderful to get to see you, Steve, again. And Sam, it was nice to have you on, and nice to see you again. We saw each other in Louisville, so it's been not Louisville. Was that Louisville?
Yes.
Yes, we were in Kentucky.
we were
somewhere in Kentucky. So it was nice to see you again.
Thank you all. I learned so much from y'all. Yeah.
I'm
Ray?
glad.
Yeah, this was fun. This is very fun. We'll have to do a part two
Absolutely.
sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great.